He showed up to a zombie outbreak with a broken stick. Every hunter in Korea had written him off before he even swung it. While trained corps were losing entire squads to hordes they couldn't contain. He was walking through thousands without breaking a sweat. While seasoned fighters burned through everything they had just to stay alive. He was pulling ahead by the hour. They thought they were watching a dead man walking. They had no idea the dead were already taking orders from him. This is the story of how the one person nobody took seriously became the last thing the living and the dead both feared. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and subscribe so you don't miss our next manhwa recap. The muscular white-haired man screamed as he threw a rage-fueled punch that streaked through the air with violent force. A silver-haired warrior gritted his teeth while slashing diagonally with a glowing blade that sent arcs of blood flying. The hooded figure recoiled from an unseen blow, their body twisting violently as blood sprayed across the air. A hand slammed a sword into the ground with such force that it shattered the surface and sprayed blood outward. Bleeding from his side and sweating profusely, the white-haired man leaned heavily on his sword while gasping for air. Sweat dripped down the scarred man's brow as he stared forward with wide, unblinking eyes filled with silent rage. The barebacked white-haired man stood before snarling zombies while purple energy crackled around him and the air vibrated ominously. A hand gripped a sword hilt with intense force, causing the blade to vibrate and emit radiating energy lines. The scarred white-haired man lunged forward with a furious roar and bloodied fist extended, while demanding who dared stand in his way. A cloaked white-haired figure unleashed a barrage of glowing slashes that tore through the air and shattered debris amid howling wind. The old man screamed in agony as blood sprayed across his face under the force of a brutal impact. The scarred white-haired man screamed while unleashing a spiraling torrent of blue energy and declaring himself to be the hero. A muscular white-haired man lunged forward with a snarl, blood splattering from his chest as he charged through the air. The white-haired warrior braced himself with a sword before a towering red leg, while dark silhouettes waited behind him under a stormy sky. Red hair framed the man's face as he stared forward with wide, intense eyes and bulging veins under harsh lighting. The muscular gray-haired man screamed in agony as his skin cracked and peeled apart to reveal raw muscle beneath. A black-haired character in a high-collared coat stood amidst swirling red energy, while the air glowed with intense heat. The shirtless white-haired man sat on pink ground facing a colossal red foot, while demanding what was wanted from him. A man's eye snapped open in shock as veins bulged on his temple under a crimson sky. Twin sword slashes tore through a massive demonic figure as smaller warriors surged forward in a chaotic battle bathed in crimson light. A massive figure stood over a shattered crater while demanding how anyone dared do this to a king like them. A silhouetted figure exhaled a thick plume of smoke against a crimson sky while gripping a sword hilt as embers drifted by. A cloaked figure stood amidst swirling red energy and called someone an asshole while dark tendrils coiled around them in shadow. The cloaked figure turned slightly amidst sparks while calling out "hey" and asking if someone was crazy against the crimson haze. A colossal warrior towered over a lone swordsman while demanding absolute obedience with booming authority beneath a crimson sky. A dark-haired figure in red held a smoking pipe aloft while exhaling a thick plume of white smoke into the air. A hand gripped a pipe as smoke curled upward, while an unseen speaker declared that the game had just begun. A dark-haired figure in black robes stood motionless as a skull-adorned box erupted with blinding light and red energy. A man with wild blackened red hair stared forward in silence as crimson light bathed his face and shoulders. A scarred white-haired warrior clenched his teeth in fury while muscles tensed and a grinding sound echoed through the air. The white-haired warrior lunged forward with gritted teeth as shadowy hands clawed upward from purple mist against a swirling dark backdrop. A fist drove deep into a torso, sending shockwaves radiating outward as the impact echoed with a sharp thud. The white-haired man faced a horde of purple aura monsters, while one lunged forward with bared fangs and glowing eyes. The scarred white-haired man stared upward in wide-eyed shock as sweat dripped down his battered face and vertical red lines darkened the air. A colossal shadowy figure with a single glowing red eye loomed over a tiny crouching character while questioning if they failed to realize the truth. The white-haired man with a bloodied face was engulfed by surging shadow figures whose grinning faces pressed in from all sides. The red-eyed figure thrust his hand forward with a sharp crack of energy while declaring that he was now the ruler there. A character with wide red eyes stared forward in shock as sparks flew around them and their expression froze in sudden alarm. A silhouetted figure stood atop a surge of red energy while telling the target to stay and keep getting ripped apart. A round black cat-like creature glared with narrowed eyes and bared teeth while demanding next against a soft pink-hued background. White text appeared against a black background framed by red flames to display the title staff of the king of underworld Naming. A round black creature vibrated excitedly while exclaiming how cool some something was, as a dark-haired man agreed with equal enthusiasm. Glowing white text declared the titles The Ruler and the Guard of Underworld and King of Underworld against a dark smoky red background. A man in black robes strode forward with a wide grin while stating that he thought he would be sad. A man in a high-collared coat stated that Tialbo would be his successor, but still lacked something against a reddish sky. A young man with red eyes gasped in shock at the floating black cat spirit while shouting that this could not be happening. A young man laughed nervously with sweat on his brow, while admitting he had no time as a tense red aura surrounded him. A figure in ornate robes stood over a shattered rock as the sound of impact echoed across the crimson-lit wasteland. Voices declared that the reincarnation trial must begin and admitted nervousness as red energy swirled around the ominous palace gates. A ponytailed man turned his head slightly with a faint smile, while stating that he had changed after reincarnation. A hand pressed flat against a glowing red surface, while the speaker remarked that humans could do it well too. A massive red-skinned figure grinned menacingly while telling someone not to cry out of fear as a small character insisted they would not be scared. A young man with glowing red eyes stared forward in stunned silence, while dark shadows crept behind him like an encroaching threat. A figure with a ponytail spread their arms wide toward a blinding white light, while demanding if this was not the only way. A young man with glowing red eyes stared forward in shock as a bead of sweat rolled down his cheek. A round black creature with wide white eyes stared upward in stunned silence as a sharp object descended from above. Two figures stood before mist-shrouded gates of an ancient mountain fortress, while gazing up at its towering pagodas in awe. A black rounded silhouette floated above a barren landscape as the river began to flow once more under a glowing sky. Three birds soared upward through sunbeams piercing the forest canopy, while their wings flapped in silent ascent. A small creature laughed on a moss-covered roof, while exclaiming that this was crazy as vines cascaded down the eaves. A round black creature screamed with its mouth wide open in terror beside a sweating character, while radiating panic lines. A massive cauldron sat overgrown with vines and sealed by talismans, while steam rose from its base as birds circled above. A wooden ladle rested inside a moss-covered barrel, filled with liquid set amidst misty grasslands under a cloudy sky. A cloaked figure stood rigid with shock before a massive vine-choked red gate, while exclaiming that this was Tialbo. Leaves rustled in the wind beneath a bright blue sky with drifting clouds. A cloaked figure strode along a stone path toward an ancient vine-choked pagoda complex, while their shadow stretched long across the mossy ground. A young man sweated profusely on his forehead and cheek while standing next to a black cat that also exhibited signs of nervous tension. A young man with glowing red eyes screamed in panic, while demanding whether someone was only thinking about their own survival. A young man with wild dark hair screamed in rage while pointing an accusing finger forward and yelling about that moment. A small black creature with horns hovered midair while grinning widely and demanding attention amidst swirling mist and floating sound effects. A young man with glowing red eyes lunged forward in fury, while shouting that he would not be held back as the sky darkened. A hand reached toward a floating black silhouette surrounded by swirling blue energy as the figure emitted a sound of surprise. A young man with glowing red eyes recoiled in shock as swirling blue energy engulfed him, while he silently questioned what was happening. A hand pressed forward against a shimmering blue barrier, while fingers splayed and energy rippled outward from the point of contact. A round black creature with horns screamed in terror with its mouth wide open and eyes bulging as sweat flew from its face. A young man with glowing red eyes stared upward in shock as golden sparks rained down around him, while demanding to know what was happening. A young man with glowing red eyes stared in frozen shock as golden light flooded around him, and his expression locked into stunned disbelief. A man stood with arms raised and head thrown back as his body became engulfed in a blinding column of golden light. A massive bolt of lightning crashed down from the stormy sky and obliterated the ground while an unseen voice screamed out in shock. A man tilted his head back and screamed in agony as brilliant golden light engulfed him while declaring that this was the underworld. Golden light burst through jagged cracks in stone while scattering dust motes and illuminating the fractured surface with radiant intensity. A young man with dark hair tilted his head back toward a glowing orb while asking if he should also search for Tialbo. A dark-haired character gritted their teeth in visible strain as bright golden light flooded the frame from the right. Jagged golden shards framed a blinding explosion of radiant light. The masked man gripped his own neck with a twisted grin while warning someone never to use that tone again. A silhouetted figure stood amidst streaks of golden light while beginning to speak with the words, "But now I'm emerging from a speech bubble." A character snarled with teeth bared in a furious expression while screaming or roaring in rage, surrounded by streaks of golden light. A figure with a horned silhouette stood motionless before an overwhelming golden radiance that bled into the edges of their dark form. A figure stood with their back turned as a black tendril-like appendage emerged from their neck and curled upward against a radiant yellow glow. A man with glowing red eyes glared upward in defiance while demanding whether his opponent was too old to remember as golden energy crackled around him. A massive red energy explosion erupted outward with jagged white lightning and flying debris centered on a tiny dark silhouette at its core. A lone figure stood grounded before a colossal eruption of red energy and shattered stone as lightning cracked across the crimson sky. A young man tilted his head back and screamed in agony as red energy swirled violently around him, amidst falling embers and shadows. Brilliant golden energy fractured the sky with blinding intensity. A jagged bolt of golden lightning split the darkening sky with a sharp crackling sound. A jagged tear in darkness revealed a village courtyard where a swirling black and red vortex churned near traditional rooftops. A hand tore through dark fabric with violent force, while sending shards flying outward as a distant cityscape blurred in the background. The young man with glowing red eyes gripped the tattered edges of his cloak and declared that he would not go. The young man with glowing red eyes stared forward in desperate resolve, while admitting he truly wanted to reincarnate against a shattered backdrop. A character's red eye widened in shock or rage as their brow furrowed and face tensed with emotion, reacting to something deeply threatening. A silhouetted figure was bisected by a vertical beam of light, while their severed lower half tumbled away and upper torso glowed with residual energy. Flat thudding impact scattered torn paper fragments through the air. A radiant star burst through the clouds above ancient temple rooftops, while casting a luminous halo across the sky. A golden ship streaked across the night sky above a glowing blue cityscape, while trailing fiery energy as it cut through swirling clouds. A character plummeted through the night sky, trailing a brilliant beam of light while surrounded by explosive energy and descending with overwhelming force. A skyscraper shattered mid-collapse as fire and debris exploded outward, and the air grew thick with smoke and shockwaves. A black-cloaked figure crashed into the red ground, shattering it with a massive dust cloud and debris flying outward. A character with black hair tied in a high ponytail bowed their head low, while sparks and embers flew through the air. A man in dark robes stood amidst roaring flames and falling embers with a grim expression as smoke billowed behind him. A man with glowing red eyes stared forward intensely as golden sparks flew around him in a crimson haze. A cloaked figure stood amid burning rubble and tilted skyscrapers while questioning why the human world was so messy as sparks flew around them. A black-haired figure watched silently as shadowy silhouettes fled into the flames, engulfing the ruined building behind them. A black-haired youth stood stoic in a chaotic, fiery crowd with an unreadable expression as surrounding figures blurred into violent motion. A black-haired man with red eyes and a bead of sweat on his cheek stood in profile with a tense expression as sparks flew around him. A ponytailed figure stood motionless before a roaring blaze that engulfed the structure ahead, while sparks flew upward as flames crackled violently. Two silhouetted figures stood engulfed in roaring flames as sparks flew and heat distorted the air around them. Two flaming zombies with glowing purple eyes lunged forward screaming in agony as their charred flesh burned and crackled under the inferno. A young man with glowing red eyes stared forward in stunned silence while a single bead of sweat traced his cheek against a deep crimson backdrop. A man stood surrounded by shadowy figures with glowing purple eyes as sparks flew around him, and the air vibrated with a low hum. A central armored figure stood surrounded by crouching shadowy creatures, while an unseen voice declared that they were in the human world. A girl screamed in terror as a glowing purple monster lunged toward her, while sparks flew around them in the dimly lit alley. A character's hand violently twisted another person's wrist, while eliciting a cry that it hurt as sparks flew from the impact. A girl with brown hair fell backward while crying out in pain and shouting ACK amidst flying sparks. A monstrous skull lunged downward with glowing eyes and drooling fangs toward a screaming man below while its roar shook the air. Several figures collapsed onto the stone floor in unison as a sharp impact echoed through the dimly lit chamber. A skeletal entity with a lolling tongue lunged at a man whose glowing red eyes flared in response, while crimson energy erupted between them. A black-haired warrior with glowing red eyes drove a brutal punch into an opponent's face while sending blood spraying and bones cracking. Jinwoo dashed forward with clenched fists as a massive explosion erupted behind him while flames and debris flew through the air. A man with glowing red eyes stared forward in silence as his expression hardened and sparks flew around him against a burning crimson sky. Two bald figures with glowing purple eyes lunged forward aggressively as embers rained down amid a burning backdrop filled with silhouetted onlookers. A figure with a red streak in their hair stood before a burning horizon surrounded by shadowy entities with glowing purple eyes. Multiple figures slumped onto the dark floor with their limbs splayed as they collapsed into unconsciousness. A hooded figure surrounded by a horde of glowing-eyed undead demanded whether the underworld was not enough for his opponent. A ponytailed man with a glowing red eye turned his head sharply as crimson energy surged behind him, while demanding how anyone dared commit a sin. A tormented being screamed in agony as thorny chains constricted its body within a crimson void. Jagged pink lightning split the purple sky above a lone silhouette on the storm-racked horizon. Shadowy figures writhed in flames while the narration declared they faced judgment for their sins. A fetus floated peacefully within a glowing red womb, tethered by a silent umbilical cord. A robed figure stood defiantly among fallen enemies and proclaimed this was the rule of the dead. A horde of undead lurching forward demanded if their target truly possessed such madness. A skeletal figure screamed as purple energy erupted from its eyes and mouth with blood dripping down. The man in black robes muttered that there was no point in speaking while creatures lunged at him. A dark-haired character exhaled sharply against the purple sky as sweat traced his jawline under heavy shadow. The black-robed warrior drove his glowing fist into the masked enemy's chest and shattered its form. A man recoiled violently as a glowing impact struck his face and blood sprayed from his nose. A black-haired warrior slashed forward with a blade that cleaved an enemy whose body erupted in blood. A young man with glowing red eyes recoiled backward as a fist struck his side and exploded with energy. A character's eye glowed with intense red light while their expression remained hidden in shadow. A skeletal figure lunged forward, clutching its chest as dark energy crackled around it under a purple haze. A cloaked figure knelt as a blinding beam of light pierced their body and erupted in a crimson explosion. Two purple energy beams struck a fallen body and sent blood spraying across the ground with a tearing sound. A cloaked figure drove a glowing purple blade into the chest of a screaming man on the stone floor. A figure with glowing red eyes slashed upward through the air and sent blood droplets flying outward. A masked warrior drove a glowing red blade downward and unleashed a shockwave that knocked back an opponent. A dark silhouette stood motionless as violet energy slashed through the air and scattered blood droplets. A clenched fist dripped blood with red energy crackling around it to suggest violent force. A white-haired cloaked figure stood at the epicenter of an explosion as a massive red beam pierced their body. A black-haired figure screamed as red energy crackled around them and dust exploded outward midair. Thick smoke billowed across the scene and obscured white-robed figures who cowered in panic. Two skeletal figures recoiled in terror as they stared upward at an unseen threat under a stormy sky. A figure wreathed in red energy demanded to know why no one attacked while standing before shadowy onlookers. A dark-haired figure faced three glowing-eyed zombies emerging from flames as the air shimmered with heat. Blood-splattered warrior raised a crimson hand and declared that it was finally time. A crowd stood in darkness as a sudden blinding flash of light erupted before them. A dark-haired figure braced against a violent purple energy surge tearing through the air above him. A cloaked figure lunged forward as an explosion erupted behind them and illuminated the twilight sky with fire. A blood-smeared young man turned toward a floating black cat spirit and asked if the other was all right. A character with a ponytail stood beside a small round creature, facing silhouetted figures walking away from fire. Two shadowy figures stood on either side of a massive explosion as flames roared upward and embers scattered. A character stood amidst flames and embers while sparks drifted around them in the glowing heat. Blood dripped from above into roaring flames beneath a dark, stormy sky. A masked figure charged through a blazing inferno, clutching a jagged weapon and a severed head. A small black spirit floated beside a blood-smeared man and asked if the atmosphere felt different. A masked figure unleashed dark energy that writhed behind them as smoke curled from their shoulders. A cloaked figure stood motionless as a massive dark entity collapsed in a spray of blood and smoke. A shadowed figure lay motionless on the ground while an object rolled away across the dark floor. A monstrous figure screamed in agony as violet energy erupted from its mouth and its body trembled. A masked figure lunged forward, swinging a massive wooden club overhead while wreathed in white energy. A man with a ponytail tied by a red ribbon stood in profile against a blurred cityscape in silence. A blood-splattered character stared forward in silent menace while trembling with restrained fury. A blood-streaked figure turned away from a sweating black creature and told it to leave. A skeletal warrior smashed his armored fist into an unseen target and unleashed a burst of purple energy. A masked warrior leaped forward, swinging a massive blade that crackled with violet lightning as the air shattered. A cloaked figure plummeted downward through a vertical shaft of violet light while limbs flailed in panic. A bloodied man with glowing red eyes stared forward in silent intensity, with his face smeared with fresh crimson. A blood-splattered character stared forward with glowing red eyes while dark energy crackled around them. A fist struck a metallic surface with explosive force and shattered the air in a burst of purple energy. A black-haired man thrust a long segmented sword forward in a furious lunge as the air exploded with motion. A masked figure collapsed backward onto the cracked stone floor with a spray of blood from their neck. A spear tip punched through the stone floor and created a jagged impact crater with radiating speed lines. A pale gray-skinned figure recoiled in shock as if struck by a sudden realization or threat. The dark-haired warrior lunged downward with a bloodied grin and struck the white-haired opponent's shoulder. A bloodied man extended a hand wreathed in crimson energy and declared that the listener was his successor. A fist wreathed in jagged red energy surged forward with explosive force to deliver a devastating blow. A dark-clothed figure delivered a forceful downward strike with their arm and generated red impact energy. A black-robed figure drove a blade through the torso of a red-clad opponent as lightning illuminated the impact. A young man with dark hair stared upward as crimson lightning surged around him against a stormy sky. A red-haired figure unleashed a violent burst of crimson energy and shouted that Hellfire had arrived. A masked figure recoiled violently while screaming in pain as blood splattered across their chest. A bloodied man thrust his fist forward wreathed in crimson energy and snarled that he would crush them all. A dark-cloaked figure thrust a glowing white blade into a screaming enemy's chest and caused the victim to convulse. A masked figure lunged forward as blood splattered from their shoulder and black energy erupted around them. A woman braced herself against the shockwave of a red energy blast striking the pavement. A cloaked figure with a ponytail strode forward through smoke and fire in a ruined industrial space. A man in black gripped his own neck as red slash marks glowed on his hair under a darkening sky. A black-haired figure stood over a fallen opponent lying amidst rubble while the air grew thick with smoke. A character's head was violently struck by a massive dark force and their hair whipped back. A bloodied man slumped against a crimson-streaked wall and demanded to know if someone went so far just to kill people. A bloodied man grimaced in pain as he stood against a darkening red background with his breath ragged. A boot stomped down on a fallen figure's chest and sent shockwaves through the ground as bones cracked. A white-haired figure lay face down on the ground with glowing purple eyes while dark energy radiated from them. A winged figure lunged downward with a blade while a red-door-wreathed opponent recoiled midair from the impact. A skeletal figure screamed in agony as violet energy surged around its head, and it shouted in raw anguish. A dark-haired man lunged forward in a blur of motion with his face contorted in pain. A skeletal gray-skinned figure screamed in agony as absorbed vitality surged through its body and veins pulsed. A blood-smeared man glared forward while questioning if he had assumed too much under the slash of light. A masked attacker leaped downward with a raised blade toward the man below and screamed as speed lines radiated. A pair of hands held a large stone aloft while an observer questioned whether this weapon would be used to kill them. A bloodied man clenched his fist wreathed in crimson energy and declared the situation ridiculous as shadowy hands reached up. A silhouetted figure with a glowing purple blade leaped downward, while another character braced atop a rocky outcrop below. A blood-smeared character stared forward in shock as an exclamation mark burst above their head. A shadowy figure lunged forward through a burst of speed lines and missed while emitting guttural cries of rage. The shadowy figure with glowing purple eyes roared in manic fury as drool flew from its mouth. A cloaked figure recoiled violently from a blinding purple energy blast that erupted against their chest. A black-haired figure recoiled violently as a white energy blast struck near them, and their face contorted in shock. A character screamed in agony as their face contorted under unseen force and debris flew around them. A masked figure raised a jagged rock overhead and laughed maniacally as blood sprays into the air. A cloaked figure was engulfed in a violent purple and red explosion while laughing maniacally. A gaunt figure screamed maniacally with mouth wide open and blood dripping from fangs while laughing wildly in pure frenzy. A massive force slammed into the purple ground and sent chunks of earth flying to create a cloud of dust. A figure lay motionless on the ground with blood pooling around them as they emitted a faint laugh. A gaunt figure raised a bloodied stone overhead with mouth agape in silent strain as dust billowed around them. A masked figure stared at a dissipating dark silhouette and demanded to know why the laughter stopped. A gaunt figure with glowing purple eyes recoiled in terror as red energy surges around their chest. A dark-haired figure with a glowing red eye glared forward while wreathed in swirling crimson flames. A central figure stood engulfed in a violent crimson explosion that cracked the air and hurled surrounding bodies outward. A demonic entity screamed in agony as jagged purple energy tore through its crimson form. A demonic entity with glowing pink eyes screamed in rage with fangs bared and dark energy radiating outward. Crimson energy erupted outward in jagged violent bursts and tore through the air with explosive force. Red and black energy surged violently around a city building and shook the air with explosive force. Crimson and black energy surged upward in violent swirling tendrils against a darkening sky. A colossal red spectral wolf howled skyward above the city skyline while scattering embers into the night air. A man crouched low as swirling red and black energy erupted around him, and the air vibrated with suppressed power. A tiny silhouette was blasted skyward by a massive red and black energy explosion, while the sound of impact echoed. A lone figure knelt on a rooftop as a colossal red and black energy vortex erupted behind them and warped the night sky. A ponytailed figure in a dark, ornate robe stood beneath a blood-red moon with glowing eyes fixed forward. A character with glowing red eyes stared forward with blood trickling from their lips as crimson energy surged around them. A silhouetted figure stood atop a building overlooking a courtyard filled with floating spirits and demanded whether they would obey. Three red-skinned figures crawled forward on all fours while trembling violently as dark smoke and red flames surrounded them. A character collapsed onto the ground as their hand trembled violently and they gasped for air in a haze of red light. A red-skinned humanoid knelt in terror while trembling violently as another figure collapsed face down onto the blood-slicked ground. A lone figure stood silhouetted atop a building, while 3 monstrous creatures cowered and trembled on the ground below. Multiple figures lay motionless across a blood-soaked courtyard floor as red light bleeds upward from the ground. A lone figure in a dark, ornate robe stood on a rooftop ledge, overlooking a city street filled with defeated enemies. A blood-smeared man with glowing red eyes stared forward in silent fury, while gripping the hilt of a blade at his waist. A black-robed man lunged with arms spread wide, his face twisted in rage as he declared the sin of escaping. A red-skinned figure collapsed onto the ground, trembling and sweating while a bright light glowed beneath their chin as they forbade harming a human. A bloodied man in a black coat strode past a fallen enemy, his ponytail whipping behind him under a dusky sky. A cloaked figure stood motionless amid fallen armored bodies in a ruined cityscape, their red ribbon fluttering slightly as dust swirled around them. A lone robed figure stood surrounded by floating severed heads glowing with red eyes, while a voice declared that 10,000 years had passed. A bloodied man extended his glowing red hand downward to summon swirling crimson energy that lashed toward the ground under a storm-darkened sky. A hand slammed against an unseen surface with violent force, sending cracks of red energy radiating outward in a burst of impact. A hand clenched tightly as a surge of red energy erupted from its palm, tearing through the air and scattering droplets of blood. A cloaked figure slashed downward with a massive red energy blade that tore through the air above trees and buildings, scattering crimson sparks. Red-headed figures in tattered clothes stood beneath a shattered sky as cracks spread across the darkened dome to reveal bright daylight beyond. 4 bloodied figures stood frozen before a towering blue barrier, their postures stiff with confusion as question marks hovered above their heads. A red-skinned demon pointed forward while stammering in startled recognition as a dark-haired figure in traditional robes smiled faintly behind him. A bloodied man with glowing red eyes stared forward in shock and horror as he realized everything he built was crumbling. A red-skinned man leaped forward through the air, his tattered black coat flaring behind him as he propelled himself away from an unseen impact. 2 red-skinned zombies with glowing eyes lunged forward while groaning in hunger, their mouths open and bodies tensed as they closed in on a target. A vast green plain dotted with jagged stone spires stretched beneath a bright sky, while distant mountains loomed in the haze. The red-skinned man screamed with glowing eyes and streaming tears, his mouth wide open in agony as white light flooded the background. A ponytailed man stood motionless as a small dark orb exploded midair beside him, while an off-panel voice emitted a guttural sound. A blood-splattered man with glowing red eyes stared in shock at a looming black silhouette, his mouth agape as if demanding to know who stood there. A cloaked figure stood in the middle of a debris-strewn street at night, illuminated by a single spotlight, while declaring that they did not think so. A blood-smeared man with glowing red eyes screamed in rage against a stormy sky, demanding that no one dared to touch him. Heavy rain poured over a schoolyard with track and fence under stormy skies. A blood-splattered sign hung crookedly on a wall, while a guttural growl echoed from the carnage below. 2 skeletal figures with glowing purple eyes lunged forward in a hospital corridor, their mouths open in silent screams as shadows shifted behind them. The blue-haired woman stepped forward with a sharp gaze, while the brown-haired woman crouched in alarm as someone off-panel declared it would be fine. A woman with blue hair and glowing eyes grinned widely while declaring something with fiery intensity, her expression radiating manic energy against a stark white background. A woman with a hair roller glared sharply while demanding to know if this continued, as a blond boy stood silently facing the stairs ahead. A woman in black gestured frantically toward another ascending the stairs, demanding to know if she knew how to do anything. 3 glowing-eyed figures lunged down the hallway toward a startled woman on the stairs, their guttural growl echoing as she froze in shock. A stone-faced warrior screamed in agony as purple energy erupted from his glowing eyes and mouth, his outstretched hand trembling with violent power. A blue-haired woman screamed for everyone to run and go up as 3 others scrambled frantically ahead of her in panic. A woman with blue eyes and dark hair blocked a punch from a masked figure glowing with purple energy, her teeth gritted in strain as she braced against the impact. A dark-haired woman gritted her teeth in furious determination as a shadowy claw wreathed in purple energy slashed toward her face. A man yanked open a door with frantic force while shouting for it to be opened, his face contorted in panic as bright light flooded the space behind him. A woman with blue-streaked hair delivered a high-impact kick to an opponent's outstretched arm, sending shockwaves through the air as her expression remained focused. A woman with blue-streaked hair shouted that she would follow in a minute, her eyes wide and mouth open mid-yell as streaks of motion blurred behind her. A purple-skinned creature lunged up the stairs to kick a fleeing woman in the back, causing her to scream in pain as she stumbled forward. A shadowy creature with glowing purple eyes and jagged teeth lunged forward, its maw wide open in a silent roar as dark energy crackled around it. A woman with a hair roller screamed in terror and pointed accusingly while tears streamed from her eyes, her face contorted in panic as she demanded to know what was happening. A dark-haired man shielded a cowering woman from a monstrous figure's clawed strike, gritting his teeth as purple energy crackled around the beast's glowing eyes. The dark-haired woman gritted her teeth in pain and frustration as a shadowy, glowing-eyed entity erupted beside her shoulder, while emitting a guttural cry of anguish. A woman with dark blue hair delivered a powerful high kick to an attacker's face while shielding a cowering girl behind her, the impact sending shards flying. A woman with dark hair and blue streaks grinned maniacally while gripping another person's head, sweat beading on her face as she leaned in close. The woman in black drove her fist into the other's raised arm with a sharp impact, while the brown-haired woman flinched backward from the blow. A woman stormed through the doorway while demanding if someone was even an undertaker, as a man shouted for her to come quickly while rain poured down outside. A woman with long dark hair turned her head slightly to offer a faint, knowing smile as she said that if someone could not speak, something remained unsaid. A woman with long purple hair stood frozen in a hallway as double doors burst open to reveal blinding light and two silhouetted figures rushing toward her. A woman with dark blue hair forcefully pulled open a door against the driving rain and wind, her expression fierce as she stepped out into the stormy night. Heavy blows slammed against the double doors, causing impact cracks to spiderweb across the metal surface. A woman in a black shirt and tie stood frozen with wide, tear-filled eyes as rain poured down around her, while a man in a white coat shouted furiously beside her. A hand held an orange revolver steady in the rain as a sharp metallic click echoed from the weapon. A brilliant burst of light erupted in the stormy sky above a school building, casting an eerie glow over the rain-slicked athletic field below. A woman with dark blue hair laughed loudly in the rain, her eyes shut and mouth wide open as a tear rolled down her cheek while declaring she was finally free. A blonde boy with wide, shocked eyes stood in the rain beside a girl who glared forward with a hair roller on her forehead as he began to speak about an elite. A young woman with wide blue eyes and rain-streaked dark hair gasped in stunned disbelief, her mouth open mid-sound as she uttered a confused sound. A woman with a red device on her forehead shouted furiously into the rain, her face twisted in rage as she demanded an answer while water streamed down her soaked shirt. A woman with a hair roller in her bangs grinned sharply while shouting that she would make them regret it, rain streaking down around her furious expression. A woman with a red hairpin and a man in black robes stood frozen in shock as the blonde-haired man before them declared that there was none. A woman with a red hair roller jabs her finger toward a man in the pouring rain while shouting that he was completely useless, her face twisted in furious contempt. A young man with wild black hair and glowing red eyes stood defiantly in the pouring rain, pointing his finger forward while demanding to know who he was. Three figures stood on a rooftop beneath a storm-racked sky as lightning fractured the clouds above them, while a booming voice declared that this was the king of the underworld. A black-haired man with red eyes screamed upward in the pouring rain, his face contorted in fury as he demanded whether someone was suggesting a leak occurred. A woman in black slashed her blade against a man's raised hand in the rain, while he shouted that she must be crazy, his face twisted in shock and pain. A man with glowing red eyes clutched his chest in pain as rain poured down around him, while he thought that something was wrong with his body. Four figures stood frozen on the rain-slicked rooftop as a massive impact shattered the building's lower facade below, sending debris flying outward in a violent explosion. A blonde man pointed forward and laughed hysterically that someone thought they were dead, while a woman beside him covered her mouth in shock and another man smirked behind them. A young man with red eyes and a ponytail stood in the rain, grinning widely as he gestured toward a floating black orb while demanding that the kids leave immediately. A black-haired character in traditional robes grinned fiercely while punching a blonde opponent in the face, shouting that they would give them a beating as rain streaked down. The black-haired man gripped the blonde man's collar and demanded if he said violating, his red eyes burning with cold fury as rain streaked down around them. A dark-haired girl screamed in shock as a blonde boy glared fiercely at a smaller child gripping his collar, rain pouring down around them with tense urgency. A woman with long purple hair struck a blonde man across the face with a glowing white blade, sending him reeling backward in pain as she shouted that he was too noisy. A woman in a black shirt and tie grimaced in pain as blue energy crackled on her shoulder while rain poured down around her, her expression twisted with agony. A swirling vortex of dark blue energy erupted from a jagged surface, radiating violent force as rain streaked through the air, and an ominous hum filled the stormlit sky. A black-haired man with glowing red eyes stared in shock while rain poured down around him, and a blonde figure shouted aggressively beside him, creating an atmosphere of sudden confrontation. A young woman with dark hair and blue eyes grimaced in pain or frustration, her teeth clenched and one eye squeezed shut as a shadowy aura swirled around her head. A blonde man grabbed a dark-haired boy by the collar and shouted that he was done with him, his face twisted in rage as rain poured down around them. A blonde character screamed in anguish under pouring rain, his face contorted with grief as he apologized for not being able to do something, tears mixing with the downpour. A young man with wide, flushed eyes and a nervous grin stood in the rain, his cheeks burning red as he nervously asked if this was the underworld while letting out an awkward laugh. A young man stood motionless in the pouring rain with his eyes wide and mouth slightly open, as water streamed down his face and drenched his spiky brown hair. A man with wide red eyes and a toothy grin blushed intensely while laughing uncontrollably, his face framed by repeating text that amplified the manic atmosphere. A brown-haired character in a white robe knelt and pressed their hands onto the shoulders of a black-haired figure lying prone, as a faint white glow emanated from the point of contact. A blond man in a white shirt threw a furious punch forward, his eyes wide with rage and teeth bared in a snarl, as rain streaked violently through the air around him. A round black creature with white horns and a gaping mouth flinched in the rain, its eyes wide with panic as it begged someone not to hit it. A blond swordsman drove his blade into an enemy's chest, unleashing a blinding explosion of light and shattering raindrops as blood sprayed from the impact. A blond man drove his fist forward with furious intensity, steam rising from his knuckles as rain streaked down around him, his teeth bared in a snarl of pure rage. Two figures clashed on a rain-slicked rooftop as jagged lightning split the storm-dark sky above them, illuminating their silhouettes against the glowing cityscape below. A silhouetted figure stood grounded beneath a sky torn apart by jagged lightning, as rain streaked downward and the air vibrated with the crackling roar of thunder. A dark-haired man closed his eyes and held a blue-haired woman tightly against his chest as rain poured down around him, his expression somber and resigned. A woman clung to a bleeding man in the rain while shouting for someone to look at the situation, as a blond man watched with clenched fists and wide eyes. A woman with dark hair laughed maniacally in the pouring rain while standing behind a man, her expression twisted with madness as water streamed down her face. A young man with black hair and a pained expression clutched his chest while coughing violently, as rain streaked down around him under a stormy sky. Blood poured onto the stone floor in thick, spreading pools as rain streaked across the scene, and a heavy impact echoed through the air. A bleeding woman pressed her palm against a man's chest while smiling faintly in the rain, as she whispered that it was finally over, her breath trembling with quiet relief. A bloodied woman with purple hair gritted her teeth in pain and anger as rain poured down around her, while a man stood partially visible behind her with his hand resting near her shoulder. A figure with long dark hair stood trembling in the rain as blue energy swirled around their shoulder, shivering violently while rain poured down against a stormy sky. A young man with spiky blonde hair clenched his fists and screamed that it was all bullshit, his face twisted in rage as rain streaked down around him under a stormlit sky. A hand gripped a flick knife and slashed downward through the rain, sending sparks flying as it cut the air, while an unseen voice screamed that the target was trash. A blond man screamed in agony as a fist drove a knife deep into his cheek, blood spraying from the wound while his eyes squeezed shut against the brutal impact. Golden lightning forked violently across a storm-racked sky, illuminating the rain-swept darkness as an unseen voice declared that its eyes opened wide upon seeing sinners. A character gripped another's forearm with crushing force as golden lightning fractured the stormy sky above, their knuckles white and tendons taut against the rain-slicked tension of the moment. A ponytailed man with a glowing red eye drove a blade into his own hand while holding a trembling woman close, as lightning split the stormy sky above them. Folding knife struck the ground with a metallic clang as panic screamed above. The blond man blocked the warrior's path while shouting that he would not pass. Terror seized the blond man's face as he demanded to know if his voice was heard. Red eyes stared through the rain against a blood-red sky while she began to speak of ease. Shock froze the young blond man in place as cold sweat dripped down his terrified face. A soaked woman gasped in surprise before a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes loomed over her. A fist slammed into an open palm with explosive force while an unseen striker screamed in rage. The blond man grabbed the robed figure's wrist and demanded they release him from their grip. Hunched in the rain, the young blond man clutched his arm and shouted that something was wrong. Panic contorted the blond man's face as he flailed his arms and cried out that he would die. With a manic grin, the blond man jabbed a finger forward and declared they would not eat him. Frustration twisted the red-eyed young man's face as he shouted that someone had not regained their senses. Regret slumped the black-robed man's posture as he muttered that he did not know why he spoke. An ornate hand extended downward through the rain, poised to strike or command amidst crackling tension. A hand snapped the tip off a wooden stick while the sharp crack echoed through the heavy downpour. Fury burned in the blond man's eyes as he shouted that he was going to name it. Joy crinkled the young man's eyes as he held a thin rod aloft while water streamed down his face. Smiling with closed eyes, the robed man held up a thin rod toward the blonde-haired person on the rooftop. Two boys shouted with excitement that the wand belonged to Elder Harry Potter, as all lit their faces. Alarm flashed in the red-eyed boy's eyes as he raised a finger and shouted that he could not cook. The black-clad figure lunged forward and slashed the blond man's side, sending him recoiling in pain. Stumbling backward on the rooftop, the blond man gasped that this could not be happening. Crimson energy wreathed the staff as the young man with glowing red eyes declared that the beating had begun. Powerful energy slash tore through the air with blinding speed and scattered droplets. The black-haired figure lunged forward with a red energy trail and struck the chest of the recoiling blond man. A hand gripped a wooden wand tightly while an unseen force crackled with energy around the weapon. The black-haired blue-haired warrior grinned wildly and declared that blood would spill today as his blade sliced the air. Tears streamed from the blonde boy's X-marked eyes as he screamed in terror while lightning flashed behind him. The red-eyed man lunged forward with a fierce grin, creating a powerful white impact burst that tore through the air. The round black creature trembled violently in the pouring rain, with its mouth open in a silent cry. Screaming in terror, the girl and boy stood wide-eyed under a blinding overhead light as rain poured down. Maniacal laughter accompanied the red-eyed man's scream that Harry Potter must burn for his sin. The black-robed swordsman drove his knee into the blonde man's gut and sent him reeling backward through the rain. The black-haired man in traditional robes struck downward with a crackling energy whip while standing over the kneeling figure. The robed figure asked how the wounded man felt and whether his senses had returned as he groaned in pain. Gripping a broken staff, the young man with red eyes demanded to know who was there. The young man stood motionless with closed eyes while the girl ran away screaming that she hated him. The woman clenched her fists and shouted for someone to give her their hand as a large purple fist rose toward her. The dark armored figure collapsed backward with glowing purple energy erupting from its chest while shouting that something was coming. A dark mass erupted from the school building as figures scattered across the rooftop in panic, and a piercing scream echoed. Trembling in the rain, the woman with a hair roller pleaded that she did not know while tears streamed down her face. The blue-streaked woman extended her right hand forward as the word "Kacha'a Enus" hung above her head like an echo of tension. Shock widened the young woman's blue eyes as she demanded to know what time it was amid the stormy sky. Lightning split the stormy sky as one of the two women on the rooftop exclaimed that it was there again. Grotesque purple-skinned figures crawled over a low brick wall while emitting guttural moans with tongues lolling. The blue-haired woman lunged forward and shouted for someone to move, while another voice responded with immediate agreement. One man shouted for them to hurry, while another stammered for them to wait as three others rushed toward a door. A single bead of rain traced down the cheek of the red-eyed young man as he uttered a silent question mark. Shock widened the blue-haired woman's eyes as she clutched her collar and demanded to know who was there. Laughing softly, the ponytailed man touched his forehead while facing the person with long blue hair. The red-eyed young man stared forward with his mouth slightly open as he began to say the word without. Fury contorted the woman's face as she screamed through the rain-soaked glass and demanded an immediate answer. Blood dripped from the woman's mouth as she cried out that it was too late while darkness swallowed her voice. A hand slapped the back of the kneeling man's head and sent shockwaves through the rain-soaked air while he grimaced. Steam rose from the young man's head as he exhaled in shock and cried out, "Kid." Defiantly facing a horde of glowing-eyed creatures, the woman demanded they stop their nonsense and leave as purple energy crackled. Terror twisted the blue-streaked woman's face as she fled from lunging zombies and shouted that it was happening again. Pain forced the woman to press her hand to her forehead as she winced and endured the sudden ache. A hand rose near the character's face and radiated intense pressure, while their red eye glowed beneath rain-slicked bangs. The young man raised his right hand, which glowed with swirling red energy, while clutching his left sleeve with focus. Sinriwira clenched his fist as crimson energy erupted around him, and he declared his name with glowing red eyes fixed forward. A lone warrior knelt in the downpour as crimson energy swirled around his blade, and lightning split the sky above. Golden light broke through the storm clouds above the motionless character, whose head bowed low under the pouring rain. Shock froze the young man's expression as a single bead of sweat traced down his temple, while rain fell around him. The black-haired man muttered that someone should look for Tialbo as a blue-haired figure was violently repelled backward by an invisible force. Anger gritted the teeth of the purple-haired woman as she raised a glowing, energy-infused fist amidst swirling smoke and rain. Jagged golden lightning fractured the storm-darkened sky and accompanied a sudden exclamation of confusion. The young man's expression hardened as a door slammed shut behind him, and he demanded to know who dared disturb him now. Shock froze the young man's expression as he stared forward in the pouring rain and demanded to know what just happened. Another man pulled the first man back from the door handle, while someone off-screen demanded they shut up. The young man slammed his face violently against a wall while screaming in manic rage with a grotesque grin. Laughter twisted the young man's expression as he sprinted up the stairs and claimed it served them right. Water streamed down the young man's face as he stood rigid in the pouring rain while a tense silence hung heavy. The round black creature floated in the rain with a goofy grin and its tongue sticking out playfully. The young man's gaze remained fixed forward as water streamed down his dark coat and the brick wall behind him. Rage filled the masked figure's eyes as he lunged forward screaming and pointed accusingly at an observer while energy radiated from his body. Shock etched the dark-haired man's features as a woman with long blue-black hair collapsed against his chest in the pouring rain. Snarling faces twisted in rage as two hulking monsters lunged forward from behind the crouching, bloodied figure with blue hair. Violent impact caused blood to spray across the masked figure, while glowing purple energy erupted around their blazing eyes. Purple energy erupted from the ground as two figures knelt beneath a stormy sky and glowing Korean characters floated above them. Agony twisted the bloodied figure's expression as crimson streaks ran down their face and a sharp sound effect vibrated near their jaw. A single tear traced the young man's cheek as he stared in stunned silence while rain poured down his face. The blue-haired woman knelt before the stoic man holding his bleeding arm and asked if he thought she was weak. Gore streaked the bloodied woman's face as she grinned maniacally in the pouring rain while clutching a red object. Disbelief froze the young man's expression as he stared forward in the pouring rain while faint magical sparks drifted around him. The character's red eye widened in shock as the pupil contracted sharply while reacting to a sudden threat. A massive bolt of golden lightning fractured the stormy sky with a deafening crash and illuminated the pouring rain. Silhouetted figures were thrown violently through the air by a massive bolt of lightning, while a crowd below watched in frozen terror. Sunlight glared from behind as a blood-soaked hand clutched a dark garment and fingers pressed into torn fabric. Blinding lightning forked across the sky above the young man as dark, grasping hands of unseen figures closed in from all sides. Overwhelming force tore through the dark surroundings as a blinding yellow explosion erupted. Shadowy hands clutched at the young man's head and shoulders, while brilliant golden light erupted from above him. The character lunged forward with strained muscles and demanded that everything burn while surrounded by crackling energy and floating embers. A lone warrior stood at the center of a swirling vortex of red energy as glowing-eyed foes were hurled outward in violent arcs. A massive red-black energy blast erupted from the ground and tore through stone, while sending debris flying in all directions. A torrent of crimson energy engulfed armored soldiers in violent explosion as rain lashed down and impact sounds echoed through the battlefield. An unseen force threw the cloaked figure backward through the rain, while a massive fist descended from above. A horned figure strode forward through a stormlit battlefield as severed limbs and pools of blood scattered across the ground around them. Fresh wounds marked the bloodied figure's face as they stared forward with a grim expression and quiet defiance. Shock froze the blue-haired woman's expression as blood streaked down her cheek and lips while she stared upward with wide eyes. Rain streaked down the black-haired character's face as they grinned wildly and declared that in your next life you would be born as a landlord's daughter. Rain streaked around the character with glowing red eyes and sharp teeth as they grinned wildly with an expression radiating manic intensity. The wounded woman stared upward through the rain, her face a mask of exhausted defiance. The robed man laughed as he grabbed the seated woman's shoulder and mocked her remaining strength. A blood-soaked hand trembled while raindrops struck its crimson surface and dripped into the darkness below. The bloodied girl pressed her hands together with a trembling smile and whispered that she was late. The black-haired young man grinned wildly as he thrust his hand forward to summon a swirling vortex of dark energy. A hand snapped its fingers to unleash a jagged streak of red energy that tore through the stormy air. The woman with glowing blue eyes stood frozen in shock before a shattering burst of light, while the words underworld manifestation blazed above her. The cloaked man stood over the kneeling woman as blue lightning shattered the sky above them with a deafening crack. A massive white cloud formation dominated the upper sky above a vibrant blue expanse filled with smaller cumulus clouds. A character's eye widened in shock as a bead of sweat rolled down their cheek under the bright light. The lone figure stood atop a jagged ice peak, while an unseen voice greeted them as a new employee. The lone figure stood amidst jagged ice shards, while someone off-screen demanded confirmation of what was just said. The woman pressed her palm against a towering white wall and shouted that she was finally free. The young woman gasped in shock as a bead of sweat rolled down her cheek, while a radiant halo-like glow pulsed above her head. The woman with blue-tinted hair stared in shock at the dark-haired figure with her mouth open, as if demanding an explanation. A hand formed a gun shape and drew red energy circles around the index finger against the blue sky. The dark-haired man with red eyes grinned wildly while raising his index finger, as if declaring something with manic confidence. The dark-haired figure with glowing red eyes grinned wildly, while declaring something with an expression radiating manic energy. The girl clenched her fists and shouted in furious desperation as speed lines radiated outward against the bright blue sky. Two figures stood facing each other on a cracked mirror-like surface, while one asked for the other's name and demanded they hold hands. A pair of hands bound a red string around another's wrist with a sharp motion that tightened the cord with an audible snap. A character's intense red eye glared forward with sharp focus, while their dark hair framed the gaze against the bright sky. The dark-haired man with red eyes grinned menacingly while raising his hand in a dismissive gesture and telling someone they would just live. The dark-haired character with a red string bracelet clenched their fist in frustration while shouting at the smirking long-haired man who stood calmly. A hand lifted against the sky as a red string unraveled from the wrist and trailed fading wisps of purple energy into the air. The dark-haired man with red eyes gazed upward at a swirling crimson and violet sky, alongside a companion whose back was turned. Two figures stood before a towering cliff face as lightning violently split the sky above them and illuminated their silhouettes. The woman gripped the man's wrist tightly while he stared back with a smirk and tension crackled between them. The woman with dark blue hair gasped in alarm with her mouth open and a bead of sweat on her cheek as she stared at something off-screen. The character with glowing red eyes stared in shock at their own clenched fist bound by a red string and demanded to know what it was. The young woman froze in shock as a single tear rolled down her cheek, while she demanded to know what they were doing. The woman with dark blue hair gasped in shock as jagged streaks of golden light crackled behind her against a red backdrop. The character squeezed their eyes shut in anguish as a speech bubble emerged from below, and the red glow intensified the sense of overwhelming pain. The red-eyed character raised a hand in a dismissive gesture, while grinning sharply against a crimson background with an expression radiating confident mockery. The young woman with wild dark hair screamed in terror with her mouth gaping open as she cried out Jaewoo in sheer panic. The blonde-haired man screamed with his mouth wide open and eyes shut tight while a helicopter flew away in the distant blue sky above him. The man knelt on a rooftop and expressed relief that the blue-haired woman beside him had awakened while she sat up with a startled expression. The dark-haired woman reacted in startled surprise as the man beside her laughed heartily and declared that this was a relief. The brown-haired man rushed forward and announced that he saw the signal, while an off-screen voice reported there were no casualties thanks to them. The brown-haired man gestured towards scattered body parts and orange-clad figures, while explaining that the dead were visible right now. The brown-haired man laughed with his eyes closed and gestured toward the dark-haired woman while she stared at him in silent shock. A man and woman huddled together in a dark classroom, while another figure stood silhouetted in the doorway as someone narrated that they were hiding. The young woman with dark hair and blue streaks stared forward in wide-eyed shock as she reacted to an unseen event under a bright blue sky. The young man recoiled in horror as glowing green slime dripped over his face and shirt while he trembled uncontrollably. The dark-haired woman with blue streaks stared in shock at the laughing man beside her and demanded to know what he found so funny. The young woman with dark hair stared forward in stunned silence as a single bead of sweat traced her temple and the sky glowed faintly. The young man with wild dark hair bared his teeth in the rain while laughing that no one was seeing Harry Potter. The young woman stared at the red string bracelet on her wrist and wondered why he gave it to her with an expression caught between confusion and unease. The woman trembled violently and clenched her fist in frustration as she realized this was a dream, while three faceless men in suits stood ominously behind her. The woman in a black suit stood rigidly between two figures with narrowed eyes and parted lips as if demanding an explanation. The girl with dark blue hair raised her palm in a stopping gesture and demanded that someone halt with sweat beading on her cheek. The woman with dark blue hair and the man in a black suit stood face to face with tense expressions as the man demanded to know who was involved. The man in a black suit and tie glared with narrowed red eyes and declared that the ability was useless under a pale blue sky. The young man and woman stood back to back against a cloudy sky and gazed in opposite directions with solemn expressions heavy with unspoken distance. The woman with dark hair and sharp eyes turned her head slightly downward in profile with her lips parted as if speaking or about to speak. The brown-haired man slapped the dark-haired woman's shoulder with a smirk while she gasped in shock with her eyes wide and mouth open. The brown-haired man winced and sweats as he clutched his stinging cheek and insisted that Sunbi was really worried about the other person. The dark-haired woman with wide, shocked eyes stared at the man whose back was to the camera and reacted in alarm to something he had just said. Clouds drifted across a blue sky as someone asked if this was the end of work, and another replied that it was not. Two characters stood beside an orange taxi, parked in front of a building entrance with postures still as if awaiting departure or arrival. The yellow taxi sped down a city street, leaving motion blur and tire marks behind as it raced past storefronts and trash bins. The woman rested her chin on her hand while gazing out the window lost in quiet thought as the world outside blurred past. The woman with dark blue hair stared forward while clutching a red string bracelet in her hand, with an expression frozen in sudden alarm. The woman gazed up at the man as he gently held her wrist with their faces close and expressions soft against a backdrop of vertical streaks. The character's eye widened in shock as a bead of sweat rolled down their cheek, revealing sudden fear or realization. The woman with dark blue hair and glowing eyes gripped a red object tightly in her hand, while a small black cat-like creature floated beside her with an angry expression, and she demanded to know who dared interfere with her plans. An orange sedan was lifted into the air with spikes erupting from its body, accompanied by a loud crash and an off-screen scream of terror. The elderly man gripped the steering wheel with wide eyes and an open mouth and reacted in shock as he turned his head sharply towards something behind him and demanded to know what was happening. The woman laughed hysterically while sweating in the passenger seat and startled the driver, who also sweated nervously as she demanded he keep driving without looking back. The woman with dark blue hair pressed her palm to her cheek in shock with eyes wide and mouth open as she demanded to know what was happening inside the car. The woman with dark blue hair leaned forward in a car seat, smiling widely while sweating slightly as she spoke to a small black creature floating beside her. A round black creature with cat ears flinched in midair while someone told it that was cringe, and to speak comfortably with its face twisted in visible discomfort. The woman with blue-tinted dark hair sat in the back of a car with eyes wide and mouth open in shock as she turned towards someone off frame and demanded to know what they were doing. The woman with dark blue hair and wide tear-filled eyes gasped in shock with her mouth slightly open as sweat beads rolled down her cheek, conveying sudden fear or realization. A round black cat-like creature with closed eyes and a smug expression floated in midair while saying that he would do it, quickly surrounded by a soft glow. The young woman with dark hair and wide blue eyes stared in shock with sweat beading on her face as her mouth hung slightly open in silent disbelief. The man bared his teeth in a manic-wide grin as rain streaked down his face with his eyes wide with madness and his expression radiating pure unhinged glee. The purple-haired woman gripped the driver's seat with a manic grin and sweat on her face, while the male driver stared ahead in wide-eyed panic with his mouth agape and brow slick with fear. The young woman with dark blue hair grinned wildly with sweat beading on her flushed cheeks and forehead as she declared that this was exactly what she had been waiting for. A figure in ornate black robes and boots stepped forward on tiled flooring with the hem of their garment swaying with motion as a sharp sound effect echoed beside them. A silhouetted figure stood before a towering glass skyscraper that pierced the blue sky with its curved facade, reflecting daylight with cold precision. The young man with red eyes and black hair stared upward in shock with his hand pressed to his chin and exclaimed that it was so big and he could not believe it. The woman with a ponytail and black robes stood in an open doorway smiling as she declared that her target could not run away now, while the man she was pursuing walked further into the courtyard. The man with a ponytail and black cloak stood in the doorway watching another man walk away down a spiral staircase with an unreadable expression as the automatic doors slid open behind them. The young man with wild black hair and glowing red eyes stood rigid under a harsh overhead light with his expression frozen in shock as he whispered that he could see. A cloaked figure with a golden patterned back walked forward while remarking that humans were so interesting as a man in a black suit ahead turned his head slightly in confusion. A man with a buzz cut reached out to grab the shoulder of a woman walking away, while shouting "Hey" with his face twisted in desperate urgency. The young man with wild black hair and glowing red eyes grinned fiercely while declaring something with manic confidence, and his sharp teeth bared against a blurred outdoor backdrop. The man winced as a bright light flared across his face with his expression contorted in pain, while he muttered that it hurt. A cloaked figure stood at the center of a shattering glass wall as cracks exploded outward in a violent arc, while two onlookers watched from below and the air vibrated with impact. A black-haired man in a tattered robe stood with hands on hips amidst swirling dust and flying debris shouting for something to open as cracks radiated outward behind him. A man screamed in sheer terror as he was engulfed by a violent gust of wind with his face contorted in panic while shouting that something was wrong. A cloaked figure unleashed a swirling white energy blast that sent onlookers stumbling back in shock as the command to destroy echoed through the glass-walled room with violent force. A young man with wild black hair and glowing red eyes grinned maniacally with his sharp fangs bared in a wide, unhinged smile as he stared forward with intense manic energy. A character's glowing red eyes stared with terrifying intensity as their voice echoed that they would not forgive, and the air grew thick with silent menace. A dark-haired man screamed in rage with his face contorted and veins bulging as a green-haired man recoiled behind him, with arms flailing, both trapped within an environment of violently converging lines suggesting imminent collapse. A blonde woman watched from above as chaos erupted below with figures scattering in panic, while one demanded to know what happened and another shouted for everyone to run. A woman with short blonde hair leaned forward over a white railing in an office hallway with her body angled, as if peering down or listening intently, while a sound effect indicated a sudden motion or noise above her head. The character's ear bore a golden triangular earring marked with the number 2, while their sharp eye glanced sideways in quiet focus. A smiling character with short blonde hair and a yellow earring rested their chin on their hand while leaning over a counter and spoke enthusiastically about something unseen. The character's eye widened slightly with a glistening reflection in the pupil, as they silently processed something startling or emotionally charged. A black-haired man in traditional robes stood rigid on a tiled floor as red energy crackled around his body with his expression cold and focused while the air hummed with unstable power. A young man with glowing red eyes stared forward in silence with his body wreathed in crackling crimson energy that radiated outward like living flame. The young man stared forward with glowing red eyes as a crimson aura pulsed around him. He smirked faintly while staring intensely, surrounded by streaks of motion blur that suggested sudden movement. Black boots stomped the floor hard and kicked up dust with a sharp crackling sound. The dark-haired man crouched on a railing while the blonde man reached up beneath the humming tension. She admitted surprise with sweat trickling down her temple as she stared in shock at the figure before her. The boy screamed in terror as a man lunged toward him, while figures watched from the balcony above. He leaned forward with his chin on a clenched fist and stared ahead with a piercing gaze. He glared forward with furrowed brows and radiated silent fury, as if demanding immediate surrender. The character beamed with a wide grin while gesturing forward as a single bead of sweat rolled down their cheek. Her finger jabbed toward her face and caused her to flinch back with wide eyes and a gasp. He crouched on the tiles and demanded to know who the kneeling blonde was as steam rose from their head. She laughed while covering her mouth and crinkled her eyes shut as the sound filled the air. He stared forward intently with a sharp gaze as if locking onto a target or delivering judgment. He stated that he once lived in the United States while staring forward with a calm and steady gaze. The dark-haired figure commanded someone to act while the blonde woman below stared upward in confusion. He stood facing three distant figures who demanded an answer as footsteps echoed across the tiled floor. The blonde man lunged forward shouting for everyone to shut up, while the woman behind him gasped in shock. His eye glowed red against a streaked crimson background as a sharp sound effect echoed beside him. The masked figure lunged forward with a wild grin and shouted that they were going while demanding to know what the kid did. She spoke with narrowed eyes and slightly parted lips as the air grew thick with unspoken confrontation. She gasped in shock with tear-filled eyes and a trembling lip while sweat streaked her face. He opened his mouth mid-sentence and spoke with intensity against a plain background. The dark-haired man leaped over the railing toward the blonde man below while the blonde looked up in defense. He whipped his head around in alarm with his mouth open as a deep crimson aura pulsed behind him. She smiled broadly in the rain while tears and blood streamed down her face as she declared that many were good. His eyes snapped open with a glowing red iris and jagged pupil as dark hair framed the intense gaze. She stared forward in stunned silence with a single tear rolling down her cheek as she processed an unseen revelation. A sharp red slash tore through the white-tiled wall and sent debris flying from the explosive impact. The cloaked figure charged forward with violent speed and sent three onlookers stumbling back in shock. He jabs his finger forward in panic and shouted that he was sure he locked the door. He grinned widely while adjusting his collar and cheerfully declared that everything was going according to plan. His intense red eye stared forward as speech bubbles framed the gaze to create an atmosphere of threat. The cloaked figure swung a whip toward a group of startled men and caused one blonde man to flinch and shout. She stared blankly with sweat dripping down her cheek against a burning orange backdrop. She leaned over a glass railing to watch the silhouetted figures below with a tense posture. He called out the name Hella with a pained expression and trembling voice as speed lines blurred the background. He sat on the floor crying with tears streaming down his face while shouting that everything was ruined. He screamed in terror and pointed toward the distant figure of a woman in black while shouting that he was here. The girl pointed forward with a sharp object and shouted to catch him as men reacted with alarm. A hand reached upward with palm open while vertical motion lines suggested urgency or rising movement. The blonde character raised a hand to halt the crowd below while others scattered in panic across the tiled floor. She laughed with her eyes closed and one hand raised while speaking in an empty speech bubble above her head. The man strode forward in a dark robe and gripped a slender rod as he walked past another figure. She told Yomranim that he could do whatever he wanted while leaning forward with a gleeful expression. An intense red eye peered through dark hair and radiated menace and unresolved tension. The man sprinted away screaming while a suited attendant shouted for the young master to stop in panic. He stared intensely while another hand reached toward him and demanded that the other person stop. He tilted his head back with half-lidded eyes and parted lips as an onomatopoeic sound effect hovered above him. He stared intensely forward with an unreadable expression while facing another person whose brown-haired head was visible. He explained that the largest conglomerate in Korea held great influence while gesturing with three fingers. He stared forward in shock with his mouth slightly agape and demanded to know what was happening. He closed his eyes with a pained expression while extending his hand forward as if reaching for something unseen. He stared intensely as another person's hand grabbed his collar and hardened his expression with silent defiance. He screamed in agony as a dark figure struck him and contorted his face with pain and shock. He stumbled backward with a panicked expression as a figure in black robes grabbed his shoulder and he demanded they wait. He grimaced and gritted his teeth with a bead of sweat on his cheek while radiating intense physical strain. He gripped his own jacket lapel tightly while a low rumble vibrated through his chest and tension coiled in his jaw. He gripped his own forearm tightly with teeth bared in a grimace while a sound effect echoed the tension. He grinned wildly while baring sharp teeth and radiated manic excitement as he leaned forward in a dark collared shirt. His face contorted in extreme anguish with teeth clenched and eyes wide with terror as he screamed silently under pressure. He grinned sharply while raising his hand in a dismissive gesture and demanded that the other person leave immediately. The man clenched his fists with an angry expression while the woman in black robes raised her hand and shouted that he should just leave. He smirked faintly while saying that something wasn't quite right and edged his expression with quiet menace. He gritted his teeth and clenched his fists with sweat beading on his face as he shouted that he would not back down. He ripped open his shirt with both hands in a fit of rage and screamed that he would not be held back any longer. A needle strike shattered on impact with his bare torso while his fists clenched tightly in silent defiance. He stared forward in tense silence with a rigid expression as vertical lines streaked the background to emphasize his focus. The masked figure braced against an invisible force with arms outstretched as swirling winds kicked up dust around his boots. Two fists collided with explosive force and sent blue energy shards flying outward in a violent burst. The masked fighter braced himself as a surge of blue energy crackled around his clenched fist while he prepared to unleash a powerful strike. The masked figure exhaled sharply with glowing blue energy swirling around his head as frost-like particles drifted through the air. The character slammed their palm flat onto the floor and created a shockwave of blue energy that rattled nearby objects. The masked man lunged downward with furious speed and narrowed eyes as he struck toward the ground below. His glowing red eye narrowed in sudden focus and radiated sharp lines of intensity, suggesting a surge of power. The blue-robed figure recoiled from a blinding impact to their chest as a muscular opponent delivered the strike. The masked figure drove a crackling blue fist forward with glowing eyes narrowing in rage as he charged into battle. The masked man lunged forward with a glowing blade to strike, while a horned figure clad in black fur braced for the impact. The cloaked figure lunged downward through the air and drove an explosive burst of white energy that slammed into a dark-haired opponent below. The spiky-haired fighter threw a glowing blue fist forward with explosive force, while his opponent in ornate black robes recoiled from the impact. The black-clad figure descended mid-strike while a cloaked opponent lunged upward, and their clash erupted in a shockwave of white energy. The cloaked figure spun violently in midair, surrounded by swirling white energy and crackling blue lightning, as the room distorted around them. The man stood with his back turned as a violent impact erupted behind him and sent a massive cloud of dust billowing outward. A gauntleted fist clenched tightly as blue energy erupted from the knuckles and sent shockwaves through the air. The dark-skinned man thrust his crackling blue fist forward and grinned with feral confidence as energy surged around him. The masked man shouted upward in fury, while a woman on the balcony above stood with arms crossed and watched him silently. The blonde character rested their cheek on their hand with closed eyes and a faint smile as if murmuring something softly. The masked man lunged forward with gritted teeth and narrowed eyes while his body tensed for impact. His eye glowed with a piercing red beam slicing through the darkness and radiating intense focus and latent power. The blonde man with a dark mask turned his head sharply and demanded to know what was just said. A clenched fist struck with explosive force and shattered the air in a burst of white energy. The dark-clad fighter drove his fist into the opponent's torso and unleashed a blinding impact that contorted the victim's body. A young man with wild black hair and red eyes stared forward while surrounded by swirling dark energy. The dark-skinned man gritted his teeth in frustration as sweat flew from his face, and he clenched his hand. The masked man screamed while lunging forward with glowing blue fists and declared that he would crush everything in his path. A dark-cloaked figure unleashed a violent upward blast that shattered the floor and hurled an opponent into the air. Hand slammed into a dark armored surface and sent shockwaves rippling through the air as cracks spiderwebbed across the metal. The masked man grimaced in pain as a glowing blade sliced near his face and sweat flew from his brow. A dark-haired figure with glowing red eyes surged forward wreathed in crackling blue energy, while shouting with explosive force radiating outward. The young man with glowing red eyes snarled in rage and demanded to know who dared stand before him. A masked swordsman slashed forward with blinding speed, cleaved through an opponent's body, and sent blood flying as the victim dissolved into motion blur. A character with glowing red eyes twisted violently mid-motion, while their black coat whipped through the air under streaks of light. A black-clad warrior with a high ponytail leaped forward and slashed downward with a glowing blade that sent white energy trails exploding outward. The black-haired warrior executed a high-speed spinning slash that generated blinding white motion trails as he coiled with lethal momentum. A masked figure's glowing white eye narrowed in sharp focus amid streaking rain and wind. The young man with glowing red eyes raised his hand and declared that something must not happen while a shadowy figure behind him was struck by white energy. A clenched fist erupted with violent red energy and crackling sparks that radiated power outward in a burst of explosive force. A masked figure grimaced in exertion as their white coat billowed violently, and speed lines radiated outward with explosive force. A black-clad figure clashed violently with a red energy blade and sent sparks and blood flying through the air. Blood droplets and streaks flew through the air against a background of white speed lines that conveyed violent motion. A blonde character stood with arms crossed and watched a massive red and white explosive burst erupt before them. A figure lay face down on shattered ground, surrounded by billowing dust, while the air trembled with impact. A blonde woman in a white shirt stared forward with wide, panicked eyes and clutched her chin while pointing downward. A fist clenched tightly in the air and cracked with power as sharp speed lines and swirling energy radiated outward. A figure with a high ponytail stood amidst swirling mist, clenched their fist, and recalled something from before. A woman with short blonde hair gasped in surprise and exclaimed that she had been startled while clutching her shirt. A young man with black hair and glowing red eyes stared forward with a tense expression, as if speaking urgently. A blonde woman in a white blouse laughed with her eyes closed and made a swishing sound beside her. A blonde woman descended a spiral staircase and stated that more than 20 years had passed since the deceased came to the human world. A young man with black hair and glowing red eyes stared forward with a tense, angry expression in a dimly lit hallway. A woman with short blonde hair and a yellow earring marked 2 stared forward with wide, startled eyes frozen in sudden shock. Deceased figures struggled in churning waters while scaly monsters bit at them, as narration stated that humans were weaker than the deceased by nature. A lone figure sprinted across a rocky slope to escape rolling boulders, while narration explained they ran for hundreds of years to avoid being crushed. 3 small figures hauled massive spherical weights using primitive tools across a barren landscape, as narration noted they also farmed with weights weighing 100 pounds. A purple monstrous figure raised its fists and roared with bared teeth, while a smaller cowering creature covered its head in fear. A dark hooded figure with glowing white eyes held out a red garment toward a small bald child reaching up with one hand. A blonde woman gestured with an open palm and winked while telling someone to fight the deceased with a confident and playful expression. A young man in traditional black robes stood rigid with wide hollow eyes and trembling lips as he muttered that he was lying. A blonde character stood observing a bent-over figure gasping against the wall, while thinking that Yomranim was not normally stupid. A round black cat with white ears and a smug expression floated midair and said that something was long. A blonde woman leaned forward with an open mouth in surprise, while the floating creature remarked that it thought 300 years had passed. A young man with red eyes and a ponytail pointed his finger forward and shouted that he would kill them. A blonde woman laughed with eyes closed and asked, "You?" in surprised amusement against a plain tiled wall backdrop. A young man with spiky black hair screamed in fury and began to shout that the other person was something unacceptable. A blonde character pointed at a blue-haired figure bent over and panting against the wall while expressing confusion about the situation. A woman with blue-streaked hair grinned wildly while nervously insisting that everything was perfectly fine despite her trembling expression. A blonde woman raised her hand in confirmation and answered that the identification was correct with a wide, startled realization. A round black cat with narrowed eyes expressed mild frustration and said that something was a bit long to say. A short-haired character gasped with hands clasped to their chin in shock while facing a sweating dark-haired figure. A black-haired man with red eyes jabs his finger forward and yelled that sympathizing with her was unacceptable since it was God's workplace. A woman with short blonde hair coughed into her fist and declared that she was the 12 while surrounded by an aura of intense pressure. A blonde woman smiled confidently and placed her hand over her chest as she declared that her position was secure. A woman with amber eyes and a gold earring marked 2 stared intently forward with an unreadable expression charged with quiet resolve. A man sat in a high-backed chair with his arms crossed and legs folded as a sharp sound effect sliced through the air. A woman with short blonde hair sat upright on a sofa opposite a lounging man who responded affirmatively to her presence. A woman with short blonde hair and a yellow earring leaned forward and asked if anyone knew where Telbo was. A man in black robes yawned loudly while slumped back in a chair and demanded that someone find him. A man in dark robes with gold embroidery slumped forward in a modern chair and said it was not the other person's fault. A character with dark hair and glowing red eyes stared forward in silence, while their face was partially shadowed by intense, radiating lines. A young man with red eyes sat forward in a chair and pressed his fist to his lips as dark energy radiated from him. A character with black hair stared forward with a glowing red eye and radiated an aura of intense menace against a crimson background. A man in a black and gold robe clutched his head in frustration and demanded to know if the listener was lacking something. A character's wide red eye stared in shock while their mouth hung open slightly to capture a moment of sudden realization. A blonde woman in a white top held up 2 playing cards between her fingers and declared that this was the situation. A blonde character with a yellow talisman on their cheek held up 2 paper charms between their fingers with clearly visible inked symbols. A man in black robes leaped from the sofa and pointed dramatically at a seated white-haired man while shouting whether he was interested in God's workplace. A woman lounged on a sofa holding up her phone and teased that the other person was no fun because of Tialbo. A young man with red eyes held a scroll and read it aloud while questioning whether the document was a mission. A massive white circle loomed over a sky split between dark storm clouds and fiery sunset hues. An aerial view showed cars driving along a city street beside buildings and a fenced green field. A blonde boy sprinted down a city street in sheer panic with tears streaming from his eyes while a dark-haired woman chased him relentlessly. A woman with dark hair clenched her fist and shouted for someone to stop with a face twisted in desperation. A woman with blue-streaked hair sprinted down a city street while being pursued by a blonde man as onlookers spectators wondered what was happening. Two hands cradled a slender, twisted rod beneath a radiant light source, while a thin red cord wrapped around the right wrist. A young woman with wide eyes stared in shock while holding a thin blade near her outstretched palm under dark radiating lines. A young man with a ponytail turned his head in shock toward the girl beside him and demanded to know why he was taking this. A young man with a ponytail pointed accusingly and demanded that someone take responsibility and complete the mission as a special favor. A woman with dark hair stared forward in shock with wide eyes and an agape mouth as a bead of sweat rolled down her cheek. A character with a high ponytail stood in a hallway facing an open doorway and raised a clenched fist while declaring that they had finally arrived. A young man with dark hair tied back in a ponytail shouted with his mouth wide open in an expression filled with shock and anger. A girl with dark hair gritted her teeth and sweats nervously as blue energy blades crossed in front of her and trapped her in a narrow alleyway. A girl sprinted through a city street surrounded by glowing blue energy trails and screamed Potter's name in fury, while bystanders froze in shock. A boy sprinted through an alley screaming in terror, while shadowy figures with blank faces loomed around him and amplified his panic. A girl squeezed her eyes shut and grimaced in frustration as glowing blue energy streaks passed her flushed face. A dark-haired girl with pigtails dashed forward while clutching a wand and blushing furiously as a translucent, ghostly figure of a blonde woman hovered behind her. A blue-haired fighter delivered a high kick to an opponent's torso and sent him stumbling backward against the tiled wall under a blinding overhead light. A young woman with dark hair and blue eyes recoiled in terror with her mouth open in a silent scream and instinctively raised a hand to shield herself. A woman exhaled sharply and said no while denying what she was against a blurred urban backdrop. A young man in a black shirt and tie stared wide-eyed at a dark, jagged mass looming beside him with his mouth slightly open in shock. A character's wide eye with a glowing red pupil stared intensely and demanded to know what someone was doing there. A girl with purple hair lunged forward midair with arms outstretched and declared that she would correct herself now. A man in a dark suit bent forward with his hand on the shoulder of a crouching woman and glared down at her with an intense expression. A woman with short dark hair and red eyes turned her head sharply in profile and demanded that someone needed to act. A woman with dark blue hair looked upward in shock with wide, startled eyes and a mouth slightly open as if gasping. A man in a black suit glared toward a distant silhouette while holding onto a woman with long purple hair in a dimly lit alleyway. A figure in dark boots strode forward through a misty alley and left a trail of glowing liquid that sizzled on the pavement. A character's ear and grinning mouth appeared in close-up, while their purple spherical earring trembled slightly as a sharp ringing sound echoed through the air. A character's eye narrowed sharply with a glowing blue symbol above their brow and radiated intense focus as they prepared to act. A masked man stood with a wide, menacing grin as purple energy swirled around his body in the city street. The young man and the woman stared forward in alarm as cold shadows cast across their startled faces. The purple-skinned man grinned confidently while declaring that the target was no master. The shirtless, bald man clutched his side as an observer demanded they find another way out. A masked figure swung a green chair downward with both hands, striking toward an unseen target near a trash bin. The woman with short, dark hair stared downward with wide eyes and spoke words of sudden realization. The blue-haired girl gasped in shock and demanded confirmation that what she heard was true. The bald man stood with his back turned, muscles tensed beneath his garment as he faced a closed shutter. The dark-skinned man turned his head to smile broadly as motion lines indicated a sudden sound against a blue background. Mist drifted past industrial pipes and potted plants beneath a tattered curtain hanging over the narrow alley entrance. The masked figure leaned forward with an outstretched hand, radiating menacing glee as if inviting someone into a trap. The bald man raised his hand to grab the terrified boy, who screamed that he did not want to die. The grinning masked figure tilted his head back in manic glee, while crimson light dripped down his chin like blood. The man in the dark suit lunged forward with frantic eyes and an open mouth as if screaming for help. The character's eye trembled with terror as sweat dripped down their face while rain streaked vertically around them. A black shoe stomped hard on the ground and sent sparks flying outward in a burst of motion lines. The young man in the black suit sprinted forward with wide eyes and a screaming mouth through the industrial corridor. The man in the suit lunged forward with a clenched fist and bared teeth, charging through the corridor with fury. The masked fighter lunged forward with a glowing blue fist extended as energy crackled around his knuckles. A figure in dark clothes flew backward through the air by a blinding vertical beam of light while energy shards exploded upward. Two figures tumbled through a blue void as white energy erupted above them with no ground beneath their flailing limbs. The blue-haired woman stared upward with fearful eyes as a shadowy figure loomed over her face. A figure with long dark hair flew violently backward through the air and crashed into debris below. The monstrous beast with jagged horns lunged forward in a blur of motion with its muzzle open wide. The young man screamed Lee Jiwoo's name with bloodshot eyes and sweat dripping down his face in raw desperation. A silhouetted figure leaped downward with arms outstretched while the bald man below braced himself with clenched fists. The boy with furious red eyes screamed as he lunged forward, his body blurred by violent motion against a blue background. The man in the black suit swung his arm to generate a swirling vortex of energy, while shouting about engraving their sins. Pink energy exploded outward with jagged force and filled the frame with swirling light and motion. The man in the robe swung his arm with fierce intensity to unleash a crackling burst of pink energy while demanding silence. The man in the white robe swung a weapon downward to unleash a massive pink slash that engulfed the frame. The masked figure grinned wildly with glowing eyes and sharp teeth as red mist swirled around their lower face. A figure dove forward through a streak of crimson energy as explosive force erupted beneath them in violent motion. A figure in white launched backward by a massive pink blast contorted midair while debris and shockwaves erupted around them. The young man lunged forward with an accusatory finger and a furious shout demanding everyone evacuate the building immediately. The young woman screamed in panic with wide eyes and a single tear rolling down her cheek against a streaked background. The young man sprinted forward with terrified eyes and gritted teeth promising to return soon, while a monstrous shadow lunged behind him. The young man froze in profile with unblinking eyes and a bead of sweat as lines of shock burst from his head. The cloaked figure recoiled violently as a glowing hand erupted with energy behind them while screaming in disbelief and denial. The young man's eye widened in terror and his mouth gaped open as motion blur rushed past him at high speed. The man crouched low as massive red energy slashes tore through the air, while he thought desperately of moving immediately. A massive pink energy wave erupted upward with explosive force and shattered the surrounding darkness in a violent burst of light. The robed man screamed as he swung a glowing pink blade downward with rage and effort emphasized by streaking motion lines. The pink-haired character stared in frozen terror at a looming shadowy figure with glowing eyes and jagged teeth. A purple-gloved hand thrust forward with explosive speed, while trailing white motion lines and blue energy bursts through the air. Two figures collided midair with explosive force as one wreathed in red energy struck the other trailing white shockwaves. The young man in the white robe lunged downward with glowing red energy crackling around his arms while shouting about the hammer. A boot stomped downward with violent force and shattered the ground beneath it while sending shards flying outward. The masked figure in the dark suit leaped upward with arms outstretched commanding his body to float as red energy surged around him. The cloaked figure slashed upward with a glowing blue blade to decapitate their opponent in a burst of blood and light. The bloodied man gritted his teeth as a forceful impact struck him, and his body recoiled violently from the blow. The white-coated fighter unleashed a massive crimson energy slash that collided with an armored opponent and sent them reeling backward. The bearded, bald man grimaced in pain as blood trickled from his nose, while red energy crackled violently around him. The man recoiled midair with a strained expression and realized he must land to avoid disaster as crimson energy crackled around him. A glowing purple blade slashed through the air with violent force and sent shockwaves rippling outward as dark energy crackled along its edge. The masked muscular figure lunged forward with a glowing blade trailing purple energy as dark smoke swirled around him. The young woman recoiled in terror as swirling purple energy engulfed her face while tears streamed from her bloodshot eyes. The muscular figure crouched low as a towering shadowy mass erupted upward behind him in a violent burst of purple energy. The masked warrior wreathed in dark purple energy leaped downward with arms outstretched toward a man staring upward in shock. The masked attacker lunged forward with a dark blade aimed at the boy's chest while the boy recoiled in shock and terror. The young man grimaced in pain as a powerful force struck him and his head snapped back while shouting that it hurt. Purple energy slashes tore through a warehouse corridor and kicked up clouds of debris and dust. Blood arced violently through the air against a stormy sky while trailing from an unseen source with forceful motion. Purple energy surged from a dark amorphous mass, erupting amidst white smoke against a city backdrop. A shadowy figure emerged from a pool of dark liquid, clutching their head as purple and black energy swirled around them. The grinning bald figure surged forward wreathed in purple energy and black tendrils while unleashing a violent burst of power. A skeletal figure with a glowing blue aura lunged forward, driving its fist directly at the viewer as white energy streaks radiated outward. A dark curved object streaked through the air with intense speed lines trailing behind it. A massive dark wave crashed forward with violent force and churned white foam and spray into the air. The blue-haired woman lunged forward and slashed a blade across the torso of a shadowy figure, sending shards of dark energy flying. The man with dark hair and a white coat stared forward with one glowing eye while mist swirled around his shoulders. The woman arched backward as a glowing crescent blade sliced through the air above her while shouting that she was done. The character with dark hair stared intensely through shadowed bangs and demanded to know who dared challenge them. The woman with dark hair and blue eyes recoiled in shock as a glowing pink energy slash tore through the air before her. The man in the white shirt crouched low while a towering black figure loomed behind him as someone shouted about shrouds. The battered man collapsed onto his hands and knees in front of a shattered grid, while saying that the other person was the exception. The woman screamed in rage with wide eyes and bared teeth while demanding if someone wanted to die. The girl lunged forward in a crouched sprint and dodged a glowing purple energy slash that tore through the air behind her. The dark-haired figure drove a glowing blade upward through a winged enemy's torso and obliterated its head in a burst of light. The young woman smiled brightly while looking off to the side as a soft breeze stirred her hair. The battered man in the torn lab coat stumbled backward with wide eyes and trembling limbs while demanding to know what was being said. The woman executed a high kick that connected with an opponent's head and sent them reeling backward in the brick alleyway. The young woman gasped in delight and clutched her chest while exclaiming that her body felt light as a red string bracelet glowed. The bald man with gray skin screamed in agony as black sludge erupted from his forehead and blood sprayed from his mouth. The horned figure grimaced in agony as black liquid erupted from their head and blood sprayed from their mouth amid swirling motion lines. The shadowy horned entity lunged forward with explosive force toward a masked figure who braced in a defensive stance. The figure crouched beneath a towering viscous black mass that crashed down around them and sent debris flying with a sharp crack. The young woman stared forward with intense focus and a single tear tracing down her cheek while gritting her teeth in silent determination. The muscular horned figure wreathed in crackling purple energy lunged forward, with claws extended as dark tendrils writhed across his torso. The lone figure stood on a vast stone platform as swirling purple energy erupted nearby, while an unseen force commanded something to turn around. The young man screamed with wide, bloodshot eyes and sweat pouring down his face as if demanding something in raw anguish. A bald, grinning figure with a glowing purple eye emerged from swirling dark mist and shadowy tendrils radiating malevolent power. A shadowy entity with a glowing purple eye emerged from swirling dark mist, radiating an aura of malevolent power. The masked figure in dark clothing stood braced on a tiled rooftop, as swirling purple energy erupted violently around them, distorting the air. The masked woman stumbled backward against the tiled wall as purple energy surged from below, her body tensing in sudden alarm. Tears filled wide eyes while sweat dripped down a trembling face, radiating pure shock through the air. Dim blue light illuminated brick apartment buildings with dark windows and mounted air conditioning units along their walls. Industrial ventilation units and wooden pallets cluttered the alley beside a brick building under the cover of night. A girl with blue-streaked hair clenched her fist as a red glow ignited around her ring, while ghostly figures loomed behind her. A young woman with dark blue hair turned sharply over her shoulder as a glowing white symbol flared against her back. A dark-haired figure in a black suit blocked a glowing purple energy slash with their forearm, gritting their teeth against the impact. A woman with dark hair raised her arms defensively as a white energy blast struck her forearm and sent shockwaves through the air. Dark blue hair framed wide, tear-filled eyes that gritted their teeth in anguish while a single tear rolled down a cheek. A woman in black fired a glowing red device that unleashed a purple energy blast, engulfing an unseen target in swirling mist. A young woman with dark hair and blue eyes stared forward in shock as sweat beaded on her face during a sudden revelation. A woman with long dark hair stood in a tiled room with an extended arm as if she had just struck something. A close-up revealed a character's wide, trembling eye reflecting fear as sweat beads and motion lines emphasized intense emotional distress. Purple and white energy streaks slashed diagonally across a deep blue sky, trailing smoke and speed lines as they descended with violent force. A woman in black delivered a swift kick that sent a shadowy figure flying backward through the air with fierce battle intent. A dark-haired character winked and grinned with sharp teeth while purple energy swirled around them, and a blue eye gleamed with mischief. Purple energy swirled violently around a dark, shadowy figure as its form distorted and pulsed with ominous power. A jagged slash of white energy tore through swirling purple mist, accompanied by the sharp crack of impact. A woman with dark hair and blue eyes stood tensed in a city alley with a fierce expression as energy crackled around her fist. A lone figure with long dark hair crouched low on the stone floor as violent wind ripped through the space and kicked up dust. Purple energy surged outward in a violent burst that tore through the air with explosive force. A woman with dark hair and blue streaks raised her fists in a fighting stance while panting heavily and glaring forward with wide eyes. The young woman's eyes widened in shock and fear as sweat beads formed on her cheek, and her gaze fixed upward with trembling intensity. The character's blue eye widened in shock and reflected light as strands of dark hair framed the gaze to convey sudden realization. A shadowy figure with a skeletal face lunged forward and drove a glowing purple fist into the back of a crouching man in black. A woman with dark blue hair lunged forward in terror and screamed that the monster was coming for her as a shadowy creature leaped down. A shadowy skull-headed figure lunged forward with violent speed while its form blurred by motion and surrounded itself with explosive purple energy. A woman with dark blue hair whirled around in alarm and demanded to know who was there with wide eyes full of sudden fear. The woman pointed her finger forward with a furious expression and declared that she would not be ignored as pink energy flared around her. A cloaked figure hurtled backward through a crimson energy blast, while the attacker declared that any target hit even once was already finished. A shadowy figure with a jagged grin lunged forward through swirling red energy, while its form remained partially obscured by streaks of pink light. The character's eye glowed with red energy and bore a branded seal as dark tendrils lashed across their face in violent motion. A masked woman in black stood ready on a dark street, facing a floating red spirit marked with a seal as crimson energy coiled around her feet. A young man with dark hair and wide, bloodshot eyes lunged forward in a desperate plea and shouted that they must trust him. A woman with dark hair and a black shirt clenched her fists with blood dripping from her right hand, while demanding where the next one came from. The character's wide eye trembled in shock as a single tear rolled down their cheek to reflect sudden dread or realization. A woman with dark blue hair smiled gently while clenching her fists to radiate quiet determination against a glowing backdrop. A battered character grimaced with strained intensity and whispered "you" through clenched teeth while their face remained shadowed and trembling under unresolved fury. A man with a menacing grin lunged downward toward a terrified woman who screamed in panic as she recoiled from his sudden approach. A girl with gray hair screamed in terror with wide, shadowed eyes and sweat flying from her face as she clutched something tightly. A disheveled man with bloodshot eyes and a bruised face grinned wildly while exhaling sharply and declaring that he had watched many movies. The character's eyes snapped wide open in sudden shock as the red pupil contracted sharply and white speed lines radiated outward to convey jarring realization. A woman with long dark hair swung a glowing blade in a wide arc that cleaved through a masked shadowy figure mid-lunge. A dark-haired character with wide eyes stood frozen as a violent splash of black liquid erupted across their torso and radiated outward in sharp white streaks. A dark-haired warrior lunged forward with a glowing blade aimed at an enemy's head, while wind swirled violently around her fierce expression. A dark-haired figure in black lunged forward with a slashing motion that sent a white-haired opponent reeling backward amid splashing liquid and explosive impact lines. A shadowy figure with glowing purple eyes took simultaneous impacts to the head and leg, while an off-screen voice called out the precise locations of each strike. The masked figure recoiled violently as a blinding white impact exploded across their torso, while an off-panel voice shouted about the location of the blow. A massive armored figure absorbed a blinding impact to its torso and shouted that it was 2 o'clock while its body trembled under the force. A massive, jagged blade shattered through a stone surface with explosive force and sent shards and dust flying outward in a violent burst of energy. A figure in black lunged toward a dissolving puddle while shouting Jiwoo's name in panic as another character rushed forward with arms outstretched. Bloody Battle grinned wildly with sweat on his brow and raised one hand while declaring that it was Bloody Battle under a starry night sky. A monstrous purple-skinned creature with a snarling grin was violently struck in the face by a massive splash of white liquid that erupted outward. A green-haired man in a wide-brimmed hat crouched on a ledge and tipped his hat while grinning wildly and declaring that he was ready to start. The witch crouched with a manic grin and declared that it would be a shame while asking if they wanted help with wide, unhinged eyes. A green-haired figure wearing a hat gazed forward with narrowed eyes against a darkening sky, while their expression remained calm yet watchful. A girl with blue-streaked hair held a bleeding man in her arms while staring ahead in shock as a masked figure leaped toward them from shadows. A woman with dark hair and blue eyes stood in the foreground, demanding to know who someone was, while a bloodied man behind her clenched his fist. A witch with wide, panicked eyes and a forced grin raised her hand in greeting, while stammering that she was a big deal. A figure in a wide-brimmed hat and white coat pointed toward 2 standing figures while asking if they could take that friend near a limp body. A woman with blue-streaked hair recoiled in shock and demanded if the thing before her was truly dead, while a small figure in a witch hat stood calmly behind Sludge. A witch with curly hair and a wide grin raised her finger as a red energy blast erupted beside her, while she declared that this was the end. A robed figure raised a single finger to unleash a blinding pink energy blast that shattered the air with explosive force and radiated light in all directions. A young martial artist in traditional robes lunged forward with a glowing red energy blade and shouted that he would not lose as the air crackled with power. A woman with short dark hair screamed in terror as pink energy flared before her, and she recoiled from the sudden surge of power. A gloved hand held a glowing golden object as green energy erupted, and blood splattered through the air. The masked figure drove his fist into the opponent's abdomen and ruptured flesh with a sickening spray of blood while grinning wildly beneath his bandana. The young man recoiled in shock as green energy slashed across his body, and blood sprayed from his mouth with wide eyes full of pain. A character with glowing green eyes and blood-splattered clothing glared upward and said that someone did not know something well under dim, tense lighting. A young woman with dark hair and wide, tear-filled eyes screamed in terror with her mouth agape, and fangs visible as vertical motion lines blurred the background. The masked swordsman stood unmoving as his green energy slash cleaved through the fleeing man's back and sprayed blood across the alley while the victim collapsed. A green-haired figure in a wide-brimmed hat bared fangs with wild, glowing eyes and lunged forward while screaming that the hunt began now. A blue-haired figure leaped midair to deliver a slashing attack toward a crouching opponent in a wide-brimmed hat who braced for impact and remarked on the aggression. A character's eyes widened in shock as their face twisted into a snarl and bared teeth, while green energy crackled around them to radiate raw fury. A man with green hair and a grimacing expression lunged forward with his face contorted in exertion or rage, as motion lines streaked across the frame. A pale-skinned character with glowing green eyes pressed a finger against a burning talisman that emitted green flames and smoke, while their expression twisted in a sinister grin. A dark-haired figure was violently flung backward through a swirling green vortex, while another character braced against the storm's force at its center and screamed in agony. A blue-haired character clutched their bleeding mouth and nose, while coughing violently as green energy swirled around them in a chaotic burst. A cloaked figure with wild green hair stood at the center of a violent green vortex, with arms flung wide and mouth open in maniacal laughter. A hooded figure with green-tinged skin and glowing eyes screamed in rage and bared fangs, while demanding to know why anyone would care about their sunbeam. A monstrous face snarled with bared fangs and a glowing green eye while declaring that humans were like crazy as eerie energy swirled around it. A pale green energy surge streaked diagonally across the frame and trailed dark crimson blood droplets in its violent wake. A character's head was struck by a violent green energy blast that sent blood flying through the air, while someone shouted that they did not care about other people's lives. A witch-like character with a wide-brimmed hat and flowing robes spun midair within a swirling green vortex and declared that this was how humans should be. A character with wild dark hair grinned maniacally while green energy crackled around their face and their eyes narrowed in malicious glee as they unleashed a surge of power. A cloaked figure hovered midair wreathed in green energy and called the bloodied man below a pathetic person, while the injured man collapsed against the building wall. The character's eye widened in shock as vertical streaks of light rained down around them, and their pupil reflected a tiny green triangular shape. A woman with dark hair clutched a wounded man to her chest as blood sprayed from his back and her face twisted in anguish. A man in a black uniform splattered with blood coughed forcefully and expelled green mist as he turned away while the red kanji for Hunjin appeared behind him. The wizard recoiled in visible shock with wide eyes and paling skin, while demanding to know why they were doing this in thick air. A blood-stained figure with long dark hair stood bowed in a dim alley with their face hidden and shoulders tense under the weight of silence. A man with green eyes and sharp fangs lunged forward with a terrifying grin and screamed that he would devour everything as the air crackled with violent energy. A character with green eyes and curly hair gritted his teeth in a furious snarl, while shouting that this was an important thing under the shadow of his hat. The character's wide eye marked by a green triangular pupil trembled as sweat dripped down their face to convey overwhelming fear or shock. A blue-haired woman screamed with blood streaming from her eye and down her cheek, while sweat dripped from her face against a cold blue backdrop. A figure in a white coat and black hat stood with a clenched fist casting a long shadow across the dim floor, while another person sat huddled against the far wall. A dark-haired character stood in profile against a red-purple gradient background with their head slightly bowed and face obscured by shadow to convey silent tension. The young man's eye glowed with a crimson, gear-like pupil as swirling red energy erupted around his head and shoulders and cast sharp shadows across his stoic face. The character advanced with a heavy, deliberate stride. A dark-haired observer watched the back of a figure in a wide-brimmed hat and white coat under dim blue light. The curly-haired blonde stood in profile on a dim street, their tense gaze fixed on something unseen. A sharp-jawed character stared intently forward, narrowing a green eye in focus or suspicion under dim lighting. A blood-stained woman knelt beside a fallen figure, reaching toward them in silent desperation on the cold floor. Shock froze a dark-haired character's expression as speed lines radiated from their single visible green eye. Wild green hair and glowing eyes marked a figure staring forward in shock, while a smaller companion peered from behind. A black-haired man with a glowing red eye stared intensely at a shadow-obscured figure amidst humming tension. Sweat beaded on a curly-haired character's face as he swallowed hard against a deep red background. A crouching figure watched a massive plume of glowing red energy erupt upward, casting an ominous crimson glow. A woman gasped in terror as a blade sliced her cheek, drawing blood and sending tears flying from her eyes. A trembling hand clutched a blood-stained yellow paper charm while sweat beaded on the skin around it. A figure in a wide-brimmed hat slumped beside a woman who walked away into the dim blue corridor. A sweating man with glowing red eyes leaned forward to demand if everything was okay with urgent intensity. A screaming woman clutched a limp boy to her chest, her eyes wide with terror as speed lines radiated outward. A young man closed his eyes and accepted a tight embrace, his face marked by faint scratches. A man in a black coat thought the situation must end if it continued while standing amidst swirling blue energy. A tear-filled young woman gasped in horror with her mouth open mid-scream as an injured person rested against her shoulder. A wild-haired young man grinned fiercely with bared teeth as blue energy crackled around him in unleashed power. Tears welled in a young woman's eyes as she stared forward in silent disbelief while white particles drifted around her. A cloaked figure stood before a fractured dimensional rift as shards of reality peeled away to reveal a modern building. A young man touched his temple with a smug smile while blue petals drifted around him, him in a cool-toned room. A masked figure in black robes stood calmly with hands on hips as spectral blue energy erupted behind him. A shadowy figure screamed in terror with sweat flying from its face as vertical streaks of panic surrounded it. A young boy with red eyes recoiled in trembling terror and screamed that something was coming against streaking blue light. A robed young man jabbed his finger at a floating cat and shouted for it to forget its fixation. A man in a wide-brimmed hat stood silently in an alley, while another character's furious eye glared nearby. The elf stared with wide, glowing eyes in stunned silence as a chill ran through the air. A cloaked figure exhales sharply with their mouth slightly open, as if muttering something under their breath. A masked figure clenched a fist amid swirling energy and declared that the victim would pay dearly for fooling him. A woman in black traditional robes delivered a devastating uppercut that sent her opponent flying into the air. The young man with glowing red eyes clenched his fist and narrowed his gaze as if declaring he would not hold back. A boot stomped down hard on the floor, kicking up a violent spray of water and debris. The sorcerer thrust his hand forward to unleash a blast of green energy, while talismans swirled violently around him. The elf snarled as green energy cracked violently across his hat, his eyes wide with fury. A black-haired figure lunged forward with a corrupted, glowing arm extended as green energy streaked across the background. The black-clad warrior dashed forward through a vortex of green and red energy toward an unseen target. A masked figure unleashed a surge of crackling green energy that erupted outward with violent force. The man with red eyes raised his hand wreathed in surging crimson energy as dark tendrils coiled around his fingers. A man with glowing red eyes stared intensely as a swirling mass of crimson energy erupted beside his face. A figure wreathed in black and red energy glared, while another man screamed in terror as green slime dripped down his face. A cloaked figure unleashed a surging tide of crimson energy that erupted upward, while another character recoiled midair. Red and black demonic flames surged upward through a vortex of green energy, crackling with violent motion. Red and black energy surged violently amid swirling green light, erupting with explosive force. A sweating man with green hair gritted his teeth and thrust a talisman forward while shouting that he would not yield. A cloaked figure streaked through the air trailing green energy and collided with a red-black aura that erupted violently. A cloaked figure crouched low as green energy erupted around them while shouting that the attack had begun. A character wearing a dark hat stared forward with wide green eyes and bared teeth as sweat dripped down their face. A black-haired man raised his arm to block an incoming strike, generating a white circular energy shield. A dark-haired fighter drove a glowing punch into the chest of a green-haired man, sending him recoiling in shock. A green-haired character lunged forward through streaking motion lines, with an expression twisted in fierce determination. A masked figure unleashed a swirling vortex of green energy that propelled 8 glowing talismans outward in a deadly circle. A figure in white was violently flung backward by a swirling vortex of green energy, while another character loomed above. A young man with red eyes stood motionless as swirling green energy erupted around him despite the violent wind. A monstrous eye with a glowing green triangular pupil widened in shock beneath a heavy dark mass. The man in the wide-brimmed hat clenched his fist with a manic grin while shouting that he would crush them all. A massive green energy sphere erupted in the alley, sending a cloaked figure stumbling backward as debris scattered. Green energy surged violently across the frame in jagged, overlapping waves. The wounded fighter with glowing red eyes clenched her bloodied fist as green energy swirled violently around her. The hooded figure raised his hand to summon glowing talismans while grinning wildly and declaring that an empty wagon was what they said. A woman with wild dark hair and glowing green eyes screamed in rage with her mouth wide open. A cloaked figure raised their hand to unleash a massive surge of green energy that engulfed the surrounding ruins. A jagged green energy blade surged forward with explosive force, trailing dark mist and glowing particles. A cloaked figure channeled a massive green energy blast that surged upward and shattered the air while buildings loomed in the background. A swirling mass of dark energy erupted violently against a bright green background, suggesting an explosive magical discharge. A cloaked figure crouched low as a towering wave of green energy crashed down around them while glowing characters screamed across the air. A character with wild dark hair and glowing green eyes snarled fiercely with their face contorted in rage. A character's glowing green eye narrowed in sharp focus amid swirling motion lines as energy crackled around them. A hooded figure stood with arms outstretched as a massive sphere of green energy erupted around them. A dark figure stood at the center of a violent red and black energy explosion, surrounded by jagged motion lines. A green-haired character sweated profusely with wide, terrified eyes and gritted teeth as red streaks blurred the background. A silhouetted figure with a ponytail stood engulfed in swirling red and black energy, while someone off-screen spoke with regret. A hand reached forward through swirling red and black energy, as if grasping for something unseen. A young man with glowing red eyes grinned wildly and declared that a deal had been made as dark red energy swirled. A man with red eyes and a wild grin thrust his glowing fist forward, and declared Hellfire as swirling crimson energy erupted. A fist wreathed in swirling red energy pulsed with violent force as dark tendrils writhed around it. A cloaked figure floated amidst swirling red and black energy as a bright cross-shaped light pierced the darkness. A cloaked figure slashed through a swirling vortex of crimson energy, sending shockwaves rippling outward. A woman with curly orange hair screamed in sheer terror with tears streaming down her face as she recoiled from an unseen horror. A dark-haired man with a glowing red eye grinned savagely while thrusting his fist forward as swirling crimson energy erupted. A character's eye glowed with a vertical red pupil as swirling crimson energy engulfed their face.